No threats were transmitted to the Dominion. No counter-declarations of war were broadcast across the galactic networks. The entertainment channels from Earth went dark. Civilian trade routes, which had been among the busiest in the outer quadrants, simply stopped. Even the constant, cheerful noise of human cultural media, the music and stories and sports broadcasts that had been quietly seeping into alien space for decades, fell silent. It was as if an entire species had drawn a single, slow breath and was holding it. In the Dominion Council chamber, the intelligence reports that began arriving in the days that followed created a subtle, growing unease that no one wanted to be the first to name. "They're hiding," one commander insisted, studying the empty trade corridors on his display. "They're afraid, and they're hiding." But a young analyst named Sci-fi, one of the Dominion's few experts in human behavioral history, was studying different data entirely. She had spent the last 3 years cataloging human conflict patterns, and what she saw in the silence did not look like fear. "Humans do not react quickly," she said carefully, when she was finally permitted to address the Council's Intelligence Subcommittee. "They are not a species that responds to threat with immediate, reflexive action. They assess. They prepare. And when they finally commit—" She paused, choosing her words with precision. "They do not respond to a threat. They eliminate it." The subcommittee chair dismissed her with a wave of his tentacle. The Council had more pressing matters. To demonstrate the consequences of defiance, and perhaps to provoke the response they expected, the Dominion authorized a targeted strike. A human mining colony on the Outer Rim, population 12,000, was surrounded and destroyed within minutes by a Dominion rapid response fleet. It was clean, efficient, and deliberately public. Victory announcements were broadcast on every frequency the Dominion controlled. The message was intended to be unmistakable. "This is what resistance costs you." Earth still did not reply. But then the long-range sensors began reporting something strange. Ships were moving across human space. Not the military vessels the Dominion expected, but cargo transports, research ships, passenger liners, old colonial freighters that should have been decommissioned years ago. They were converging on human shipyards and orbital stations. And when they emerged, they were different. Weapon systems had been mounted on hulls never designed to carry them. Armor plating, crude in places but effective, had been welded over civilian-grade shielding. Agricultural haulers had been fitted with torpedo bays. Medical frigates carried point defense turrets alongside their surgical suites. Humanity was not mobilizing a military. They were becoming one. Sci-fi submitted another report to the Council that evening. It went unread, but she noted, in the privacy of her own journal, that for the first time in her career, she was genuinely frightened. The first major engagement came 3 months after the declaration of war, near a stretch of deep space known as the Helios Drift, a region of weak gravitational currents and scattered stellar debris that made conventional fleet formations difficult to maintain. The Dominion chose it deliberately, believing the terrain would nullify any human advantages in improvised warfare. They positioned their fleet in a formation that had been refined over 800 years of galactic conquest, layered, interlocking, practically impenetrable. Their warships were massive, purpose-built instruments of destruction, carrying weapons technology that predated humanity's industrial revolution. Their commanders had fought dozens of wars. They had never lost one. When the human fleet appeared on their sensors, several of the Dominion officers actually relaxed. The human formation was irregular, almost chaotic to trained eyes. Military vessels were interspersed with obviously converted civilian ships. Some carried mismatched weapon configurations. Some looked as though they had been armored by people who had read about armor but never seen a real warship. The Dominion admiral, a veteran named Cosbeth who had conquered 4 civilizations in his career, looked at the display and felt something very close to pity. "This will be brief," he said quietly. He gave the order to fire. The first Dominion volley tore through the front line of human ships like light through glass. Explosions bloomed in the darkness, silent and beautiful from a distance, and dozens of human vessels came apart in cascading detonations. The Dominion formation held perfectly. The officers exchanged satisfied looks. And then the human ships accelerated. not in retreat. Forward. Not in panic, either. The movement was coordinated, deliberate, almost unhurried in its confidence. The human fleet fractured into smaller clusters, each one flowing through gaps in the Dominion formation like water finding channels through rock. They didn't target the heaviest warships. They targeted sensors, engines, shield array junctions, communication relays, the careful, vulnerable connective tissue that held a fleet together. One Dominion cruiser went dark as its power grid was surgically overloaded. Another began firing on friendly ships after some program, some ghost inserted into its systems, convinced its targeting computers that the coordinates had shifted. Confusion spread through the Dominion line faster than any weapon could have managed. "How are they adapting this quickly?" a junior officer shouted over the noise of alarms. The answer, which no one in the Dominion fleet knew yet, was brutally simple. Every human ship that had been destroyed in those first terrible volleys had been transmitting live battle data back to the fleet in its final seconds. Every weakness the Dominion exposed was being cataloged, shared, and countered in real time. Losses were not just accepted, they were planned for, built into the strategy as a source of information. The humans had arrived at Helios Drift expecting to lose ships. What they had not brought with them was any intention of losing the battle. 2 hours after the first shot was fired, what remained of the Dominion formation was in full retreat. Not routed, not destroyed, but broken, stripped of cohesion and confidence in equal measure. The human fleet did not give chase. They stopped precisely at the border, held their position, and transmitted a single brief message to the retreating Dominion ships. This was a warning. In the council chamber, when the report from Helios Drift arrived, the laughter was gone. In its place was something quieter and more dangerous. The first, unwilling recognition that the calculus of this war might not be as simple as it had seemed. Sci-fi's reports began to receive more careful attention. The Dominion responded to Helios Drift the way its military doctrine demanded, with overwhelming preparation. They reinforced their border systems. They pulled reserve fleets from distant postings. They fortified the approaches to their core worlds. They built walls of steel and energy across every corridor that a human fleet might logically use to advance. They were preparing for the war they understood, the kind fought along clear front lines, where strength could be massed and directed, where the enemy's position could be identified and destroyed. But the next blow did not come from the front. A Dominion fuel depot at the heart of a heavily defended supply network simply exploded, without warning, without any human fleet within sensor range. A supply convoy carrying munitions to 3 separate battle groups vanished in deep space, leaving no debris, no distress signal, not even a gravitational echo. Navigation beacons across 3 entire Dominion sectors began feeding false data to fleet computers, sending patrol ships in slow, useless circles through empty space. There was no front line. There was no visible army to engage, no planet to blockade, no fleet to intercept. There was only a spreading, inexplicable pattern of damage, infrastructure crumbling, systems failing, carefully laid plans dissolving into noise. Dominion commanders searched their sensor data for human warships. They found nothing. Because the ships that were doing this damage weren't warships in any conventional sense. They were small, fast, crewed by specialists rather than soldiers. Engineers who could access a Dominion power grid through vectors that the grid's designers had never considered. Programmers who had spent months learning the architecture of Dominion AI systems in order to turn those systems against their owners. Scientists who had reverse-engineered Dominion navigation technology from salvaged debris and now knew how to make it lie. And behind all of them, coordinating everything, was the quiet, vast machinery of an entire species at war. Factories across human space had doubled, then tripled output. Algorithms designed by university students were being uploaded directly to frontline systems. Every human who could contribute something, a skill, a tool, an insight, was contributing it. It wasn't an army fighting a war. It was a civilization conducting one. Admiral Kosbeth, sitting in his command room surrounded by a star map that seemed to grow more red with every passing day, stared at the display for a long time without speaking. Then he said, very quietly to no one in particular, "We don't know where to hit them back." His aide, standing at a respectful distance, hesitated before responding. "We've been hitting their colonies, sir. Their outer installations. We've been hitting things," Cosbeth said. "We haven't found them." 6 months into the war, the Dominion was bleeding from 1,000 small wounds, none of them fatal, all of them unrelenting. Trade had collapsed across the outer systems. Civilian populations were demanding protection that the military could no longer guarantee. Strategic reserves that had seemed limitless at the start of the conflict had been ground down by the constant, merciless pressure of an enemy that never rested, never escalated beyond what was necessary, and never, not once, revealed the full extent of what it was capable of. In the High Council's emergency sessions, the word stalemate was whispered with increasing frequency, though no one was yet willing to say it aloud. It was the eldest member of the council, an ancient, slow-moving being called the Patriarch of Vorsal, who had presided over 4 centuries of Dominion history, who finally said what the others were thinking. "We cannot win this war through attrition," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "They adapt faster than we can adjust. Every tactic we develop, they counter. Every advantage we exploit, they close. We are fighting a species that treats failure as information and time as a weapon." The chamber was silent. "Then we remove the species," said High General Marthsol, his tone flat and certain. "We end the source." The proposal was simple in its brutality, and it was approved before the session ended. The Dominion's most closely guarded military asset, a weapon that had been used only twice in recorded history, that had ended civilizations rather than wars, was to be deployed against Earth. The Planet Killer, a device that did not merely destroy populations but rendered entire worlds uninhabitable at a geological level, was prepared in a classified facility 3 systems from the Dominion capital. The theory was sound in the cold logic of imperial warfare. Cut off the head, and the body dies. Destroy Earth, the symbolic and administrative heart of humanity, and the colonies, the fleets, the scattered soldiers and scientists and engineers, would fragment and collapse. They would have nothing to fight for, and nothing to fight toward. No one in the chamber thought to ask why, 6 months into a war with a species that had demonstrated an almost supernatural capacity for intelligence gathering, the humans hadn't yet found the weapon. No one considered the possibility that they already had. The Planet Killer charged in silence. Its systems ran through final calibration sequences. Coordinates were locked. The targeting solution was perfect. Earth hung in the crosshairs of something that had erased 4 other worlds from the map of the galaxy, and this time, there was nothing that could stop it. That was what the Dominion believed. Then every screen in the Dominion command network flickered simultaneously, as if the stars themselves had blinked. Military networks froze mid-transmission. Automated defense systems stopped responding. In the facility housing the Planet Killer, a single technician stared at her control panel as every indicator light shifted from green to red in a cascade that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then her screen cleared and displayed a message. Not in Dominion script. In English. "You were warned." Panic erupted through Dominion command centers in a way that no enemy fleet had ever managed to produce. How had humans accessed systems that weren't connected to any external network? How had they penetrated security protocols that had never been breached in the device's entire history? Who had they been, and where had they been hiding, and for how long? The answers came before any of the questions could be properly articulated. Long-range sensors lit up across the entire Dominion capital system, and what they showed was impossible. Human ships, thousands of them, not approaching from the border. Not inbound from human space. Already there. Already inside the system, positioned within it as if they had been there for weeks, nestled in asteroid fields and dust clouds and the gravitational shadows of moons, their stealth profiles so precise that the Dominion's best sensors had simply accepted their absence as a fact. The Dominion had spent 6 months guarding its borders. It had never once looked inward. The human stealth fleet emerged from hiding simultaneously, like a tide coming in from every direction at once. Their strikes were devastatingly selective, shipyards first, to prevent any emergency mobilization, then communication towers, to prevent coordinated response, then the defense platforms ringing the capital itself, and finally, in one synchronized, perfectly coordinated strike, the planet killer. The weapon that had erased 4 worlds never fired a single shot. It came apart in a chain of explosions that lit the Dominion's capital sky like a second sun, a column of fire visible from the planet's surface, painting the clouds in shades of gold and red for hours, long after the debris had begun to disperse. Civilians stood in the streets and watched it burn and understood, with a cold, clarifying certainty, that the war had just fundamentally changed. Because the humans still hadn't fired on the planet. They hadn't fired on anything that wasn't a military target. The capital's civilian infrastructure was intact. Its power grid still ran. Its hospitals were still operational. Its population was frightened but breathing. What followed was swift and terrible in its precision. Human fleets that had been waiting, it became clear, with extraordinary patience across every theater of the war, moved simultaneously on Dominion command infrastructure. Not just in the capital, but across the Empire. Communication hubs went dark. Fleet headquarters were disabled. The carefully maintained hierarchy that allowed the Dominion to coordinate a military spanning 11,000 systems simply ceased to function. It had taken the Dominion 4 minutes to declare war on humanity. It took humanity 72 hours to end it. Some Dominion admirals, in the outer systems, attempted to continue the fight independently. They received no orders because there was no one left to send them. They received no supplies because the supply chains had been systematically severed. They received only a single, clear transmission from human command, the same message sent simultaneously across every frequency and every remaining Dominion channel. The war is over. Stand down. No further strikes will be made against any vessel or installation that ceases hostilities within 6 hours. Most stood down. Those who didn't discovered within the hour that the promise was being kept everywhere except where they were. The galaxy had expected, when it was over, to witness the kind of aftermath that always followed a conquest. It had watched empires rise and fall across millennia, and it knew the pattern. The victorious species would extract what it wanted, install whatever governance served its interests, and leave the defeated civilization to rebuild from ruins on whatever terms the conqueror chose. What it witnessed instead was something for which it had no adequate historical reference. Human ships began delivering emergency supplies to damaged Dominion stations within 48 hours of the ceasefire. Medical teams transported to civilian population centers that had been cut off from resources during the conflict. Engineers worked alongside Dominion technicians to restore power grids. Trade routes were reopened, not on exploitative terms, but on agreements that had been quietly prepared, apparently for some time, by human diplomatic teams who had believed, even during the darkest months of the war, that there would eventually be a peace to negotiate. The galaxy watched, and struggled, collectively, to reconcile what it was seeing with what it knew about species that had just fought with the controlled, absolute ferocity that humanity had displayed. Sayavel, who had survived the war and was now composing what would become the definitive historical account of the conflict, wrote in her final chapter, "The Dominion made an error that many civilizations have made before it, and that the galaxy will be wise to remember. It believed that a species' capacity for violence was the measure of its nature. Humanity demonstrated otherwise. They fought with a precision and a patience that dismantled an empire, not because they wanted an empire, but because they wanted to be left alone. And when it was over, when they had proven, beyond any conceivable doubt, that they could not be threatened into submission, they put down their weapons and picked up something else entirely. They had planned the war, but they had also planned the peace. That, more than any battle, is what should keep the galaxy awake at night." Across hundreds of worlds, in the months and years that followed, a quiet understanding settled into the political consciousness of every civilization that had been watching. Humanity was not the largest empire in the galaxy. It was not the oldest civilization. Its technology, while formidable and rapidly advancing, was not the most ancient or refined. By almost every conventional metric of power, there were species that outranked them. And yet, when they had been threatened, they had not fractured. They had unified, completely and without hesitation, in a way that no multi-world civilization in recorded history had ever achieved. When they had been attacked, they had not merely defended, they had learned, adapted, improved with every exchange until their enemies' own strengths became vulnerabilities. When they had been pushed to the absolute limit of what any species could endure, they had not broken. They had finished what they started. And then, having finished it, they had chosen restraint. Not weakness. The distinction was important, and every diplomat in the galaxy who studied the conflict understood it. Restraint chosen by a species that had just demonstrated it could have chosen otherwise. Mercy extended by hands that had, moments before, held the power to do something far less merciful. In the great archives of a dozen civilizations, scholars began quietly revising their strategic assessments of the galactic balance of power. The Dominion, diminished but surviving, began the long process of becoming something different, something that, with human cooperation rather than human conquest, might eventually become something better. And in the corridors of 100 capitals, a new axiom entered the lexicon of galactic diplomacy, spoken with a seriousness that had never accompanied any prior reference to the small blue planet. Do not declare war on humanity, not because they are the largest, not because they are the oldest, not because their weapons are the most powerful or their fleets the most numerous, because they remember everything, because they finish what they start, because when you back them to the very edge of extinction, you do not get their fear, you get their full attention. And that, every civilization in the galaxy silently agreed, was the most terrifying thing in the known universe. The Galactic Council chamber was silent in the way that only vast, ancient spaces can be, a silence that carried weight, that pressed against the chest and demanded reverence. Hundreds of alien leaders sat in their designated tiers, their biology as varied as the stars they ruled. Bioluminescent senators pulsed with slow, contemplative light. Insectoid generals clicked their mandibles in restless anticipation. Gaseous entities drifted within their containment spheres, their forms shifting with quiet emotion. All of them, despite their differences, shared one thing in that moment. They were watching Earth. The planet rotated slowly on the central hollow projection, blue and fragile, wrapped in thin wisps of cloud, impossibly small against the scale of the galaxy surrounding it. To the Council, it was almost quaint.
Young, loud,
perpetually divided. A species that had barely crawled out of its own atmosphere before deciding, with breathtaking audacity, that the stars belonged to them too. Humans had expanded too fast. They had refused trade limitations. They had ignored border protocols. They had declined, repeatedly and without apology, to kneel before the Dominion, the oldest and most powerful governing body in the known galaxy, an empire that had existed for longer than humanity's entire recorded history. And now, they had crossed the line one final time. Admiral Vethkara of the Dominion High Fleet rose from his command throne, his exoskeleton gleaming under the chamber lights, his compound eyes reflecting the image of Earth with something approaching contempt. He raised one serrated claw and gestured toward the holographic star map where a cluster of human vessels were marked in bright red, deep inside Dominion-claimed territory. "Human fleets have crossed our border again," he said, his voice carrying the calm of absolute certainty. "They have received 47 warnings. They have acknowledged none of them." The vote was swift. There was no long debate, no philosophical deliberation, no dissenting voice raised in caution. The Galactic Dominion, spanning 11,000 star systems and 100 conquered civilizations, declared war on humanity in less than 4 minutes. A priority transmission was encoded and fired across the galaxy, a red-frequency signal that would cut through every communication barrier humanity possessed, a message impossible to miss and impossible to misunderstand. Congratulations! You have officially declared war on the Galactic Dominion. Surrender within 72 hours or face total annihilation. The Council settled back into their seats and waited. They expected what they had always received from younger species, a flood of desperate signals, Frantic diplomatic channels opening simultaneously, heads of state tripping over one another to apologize, to negotiate, to beg. It was a familiar dance. The Dominion had performed it dozens of times across centuries. 1 minute passed. Then 5. Then 10. The silence that came from human space was unlike anything the chamber had experienced. It wasn't the silence of defeat. It wasn't even the silence of fear. It was something else, something harder to define, and therefore harder to dismiss. Then, finally, a single transmission arrived from Earth. The Council's translators processed it instantly. The chamber's main screen flickered, and only one word appeared. Understood. Nothing more. No diplomatic rider. No request for clarification. No counterproposal. Just that single word, hanging in the vast space of the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the laughter began, first from Admiral Vethkara, a sharp, clicking sound deep in his throat, and then rippling outward through the chamber in waves of different pitches and frequencies, the alien equivalent of shared mockery. Arrogant primates, General Solden of the Eastern Reach muttered, shaking his broad, scaled head. They do not even understand what they have just invited. Let them have their pride, Vethkara replied, dismissing the screen with a wave of his claw. It will make the surrender more satisfying. But far inside human space, something had already changed. There were no speeches, no broadcasts, no heads of state delivering rousing declarations of defiance to crowds of millions. Instead, lights came on in places that had been dark for decades. Hidden shipyards buried within the dense mineral rings of uninhabited gas giants powered on for the first time in a generation, their automated systems humming to life with quiet, mechanical purpose. Deep space defense networks that appeared on no public registry began their initialization sequences. Encrypted signals spread outward from Earth in careful, layered waves, not shouted across open channels, but whispered through the quantum relay systems that even Dominion intelligence had never managed to fully map. In research stations orbiting distant moons, scientists locked their laboratory doors and redirected every project toward a single goal. In universities across 30 human colonies, students who had been studying propulsion theory and materials engineering were suddenly receiving classified clearance notices alongside their morning assignments. In retirement communities on 3 separate worlds, men and women who had once held the highest strategic positions in human military history received the same brief, encoded message on devices they had never quite been able to throw away. Protocol Ember is active. Report to your assigned station. The protocol was older than most of the receiving officers. It had been written in the aftermath of humanity's darkest period, the resource wars of the 22nd century, when the species had very nearly destroyed itself and had made a collective, unspoken decision that it would never be caught unprepared again. Protocol Ember had never been activated. For generations, it had sat dormant in classified archives, a promise humanity made to itself and hoped it would never have to keep. Now it was awake,